Approaching the 1930s, the Swedish Navy faced something of a crisis amongst the larger elements of the fleet. At the start of the 1920s, there was an extensive force of 15 coast defence ships and 6 cruisers, albeit that the Ornen class were smaller than most contemporary destroyers, but during that decade, large swathes of these ships had either been retired or put into second-line roles like training vessels on account of their relative age and lack of capability. Moreover, a large number of those that were left were rapidly approaching a similar fate in the upcoming decade. Coupled with this, the rise of aviation and the threat of submarines had both developed during World War I, and with the relative effectiveness of minefields against the latter, this meant that there were demands in all directions. Sweden needed a seaborne aviation capability, it needed a large capacity mine layer, it needed a modern cruiser force, and it had nowhere near the budget to afford it all. Work had already started on the design for a seaplane carrying vessel, vaguely similar to the work that had been done on HMS Vindictive, but technology marched on and the need for other types of ship also intruded. Sturdier seaplanes meant that it was felt a hangar aboard wouldn't necessarily be needed, as unlike larger navies, the cruiser was unlikely to be going on long oceanic voyages. This freed up enough space for someone to suggest simply combining all of the roles into a single vessel. The reasoning went that a cruiser would be useful in leading the new contingent of destroyers that was planned for the Navy, but would also be large enough to carry a substantial load of mines in the stern, and then above this area it could also, if you sacrificed a couple of the aft guns, operate a substantial number of seaplanes, which would both be useful in general reconnaissance terms, but also help to support the destroyer leading role, as the aircraft could relay spotting information about enemy forces to a Swedish formation that was hiding behind islands, in fog banks, or in an artificial smokescreen. The resultant 5,000-ton Swedish Battlestar design was drawn up as an Arethusa-like set of half a dozen 6-inch guns in 3 twin turrets, a pair super-firing forward and 1 aft, but the ideal variant was entirely outside of the proposed budget. To make it more affordable, the hull was shortened by 10 metres and the power plant was reduced, dropping the top speed. The drop in hull volume meant that the super-firing forward turret also had to go, as did the planned pair of catapults, which would be replaced by just a single one mounted amidships. The displaced pair of 6-inch guns were instead relocated to casemates in the superstructure either side of the bridge, and the total capacity aft was rated at 8 aircraft. The final armament therefore consisted of 6 6-inch guns, 4 in a pair of twin turrets, 1 fore and 1 aft, and the final 2, as mentioned, in casemates. Anti-aircraft defence came courtesy of Bofors, unsurprisingly enough, with 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns in 1 twin-mount aft that super-fired over the aft 6-inch turret, and 2 single guns, 1 on either side of the ship, between the funnels. 4 single 25mm cannon were clustered forward around the bridge superstructure, with a pair of triple torpedo launchers further back, 1 on each side. The size reduction meant that mine capacity was restricted to a pair of short rails mounted astern, which area was largely taken up by the catapult, 2 cranes, and a peacetime capacity for 8 aircraft, with space for another 3 if you locked the catapult in a fixed position, although in practice the ship would generally only carry 6. 28,000 shaft horsepower came via 2 screws to give a top speed of 27.5 knots for the 4,600-ton standard displacement of the vessel, which carried minimal armour, varying between splinter-proofing and up to an inch on the belt, and an inch on the deck and turrets. Laid down in 1930, launched in September 1933, and commissioned in December 1934, Gotland took part in various exercises and training cruises during the rest of the 1930s and remained patrolling home waters, defending Swedish neutrality as World War II broke out, with occasional voyages through into the eastern Northern Sea to check out what was going on, since the Germans had invaded and occupied both Denmark and Norway. As a result, she was in a position to investigate a sighting that had been made by patrol aircraft in May 1941. First spotting and then shadowing a German formation that was headed through the Kattegat, centred on the battleship Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. This news was transmitted back to Sweden, where it found its mysterious way to the British naval attaché, who promptly passed it on to the Admiralty, and that started off the chain of events that we all know as Operation Rheinübung. That aside, Gotland's wartime experience was rather quiet, since Sweden was neutral, but with her aircraft growing increasingly obsolete, she was brought in during 1944 for conversion into an anti-aircraft cruiser. The aircraft facilities being replaced by 4 twin 40mm Bofors and 2 twin long-barrel 20mm guns. By the early 1950s, though, she was wearing out and slowing down. But she did have one final refit left in her. In 1953, this removed the casement-mounted 6-inch guns and some of the light anti-aircraft weaponry in exchange for a radar array, allowing her to become a fighter direction ship. However, she would only last a couple of years in this configuration, being decommissioned in 1956 and scrapped in 1963.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.